What's up, girl? Hey, welcome to the Vergecast Special Edition, Apple versus Samsung. I'm Neil Patel. Are we sure we run the music the whole time, Creighton? All right, I'm Neil Patel. I'm joined by Matt McCary in Arizona. What's up, dude?
Hey, how's it going?
Pretty well. And we have Brian Bishop on the phone. Right, Brian?
Hey, gentlemen, how's it going?
It's going really well. So, Brian, this is a crazy edition of our special edition. It's also the second episode, so I guess it's not that crazy. But Brian is live from the trial. So this week, the trial that was scheduled for 5 days of testimony. And so Brian is there today. And this is your lunch break? Are you eating a sandwich?
I'm not eating a sandwich. Right now, I'm in my car in a parking structure next to the courthouse, so it's very exciting.
Wow. Are you like selling drugs? Like, what's going on?
I don't like to talk about that.
All right. So I know you have a limited amount of time. Let's talk about what's going on. So real quick, Brian, you want to give us the rundown of what happened sort of on Thursday and Friday last week and into this week?
Yeah, well, I mean, first off the bat, something interesting this morning. Judge Koh asked basically both Apple and Samsung CEOs to get together to talk, one more time before the trial goes to the jury for deliberation. She'd asked them to do that a number of times, before, and asked them to do it one more time again today. They're hoping to go. She was really pushing to get evidence, all evidence in this week. Apple wants to call Susan Kerr back one more time, who can't do it until Monday. But Judge Koh basically said if you can't get, Kerr in this week, she's just going to be out, for testimony. And also asked narrow down the case. Basically, she cut 3 phones, the international Galaxy S, Galaxy S2, and the Ace from the trial altogether because Apple couldn't prove that they were sold in the U.S.
Yeah.
So she's asked them to go and trim down their claims, even further. So that was kind of a bunch of stuff that, happened this morning. And the last couple of days, we saw Samsung finally going to go and, kick into their case, after Apple, basically going after them in terms of their the 2 patents that they say Apple has infringed. That was all this morning.
Yeah.
It was a pretty dry stuff. We're talking about, standard essentials patents about, 3G, packet length and, regulating power for channels, like super dry stuff. And it was kind of funky the way it started because out of nowhere, Samsung displayed deposition testimony from 2 Intel employees with no context whatsoever, and then brought an expert on afterwards to kind of explain that. He's still on the stand. So he's going to be wrapping up. I take that back. He wrapped up right before lunch. We have another Samsung designer coming in, who just started like 2 minutes before lunch break. He's going to start again. And that follows an icon designer that Samsung called yesterday, who kind of gave some insight into their design process. It was a little weird, actually. They kind of started talking about, how hard the Samsung designers work. Apple's obviously pushed, how dedicated their team is, how much they work. And they did the same thing. She mentioned that they were working on the Galaxy S. She only slept 2 or 3 hours a night, and kind of out of nowhere just volunteered that she just had a baby at the time, had to spend time away from baby, and actually said she had to stop breastfeeding, which was just odd, but definitely conveyed that they're committed. She was definitely committed to her job.
Yeah, it's human interest. That's what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. But it made a point, and it's interesting. The industrial designer that's speaking today, as well as the icon designer, both from Korea, they speak Korean. They're having a translator go. And in both cases, we kind of saw John Quinn, emerge from the shadows, kind of question both of those witnesses again.
John
we
Quinn.
haven't seen him. Yeah, and so he's kind of, emerging again. And obviously, I imagine those bits of testimony are very carefully, constructed, orchestrated. You don't want to throw, anything out left field, witnesses, we have a translator involved. So it makes sense, but interesting changes because Charles Verhoeven has been dealing with a lot of it for the most part.
I mean, so it sounds like Samsung is kind of, their opening tack was to go with the invalidity kind of argument, right?
Definitely. And, they introduced, they showed 2 different, they had a witness, there were 2 different products they focused on, one called Launch Tile and one called the Diamond Touch Table. They had a number of witnesses speak about that.
The Mitsubishi Diamond Touch. Everybody remember that? The amazing product that changed the world.
And it's it's an overhead projector, shining images down on a capacitor. There's 3 of the software that's actually really interesting. One is called Fractal Zoom, also known as Mandelbrot.
Yeah.
And that does show very similar single finger touch scrolling and your gestures, i.e., zooming, that kind of stuff. And it was pretty compelling when they showed it. And The other piece of software was a little bit less, so it was called Launch Tile. And this was like a UI that was developed, and they actually showed it running on the iPac, which is another famous part that changed the world.
Right.
And basically had a rough approximation of a kind of inverse bounce back feature. Long story short, on this particular UI, you'd have like a huge field of tiles, and you could drill down one level for the screen to be cut into quarters, and each would show one of those tiles. If you scroll a little bit, along the left or right or up and down, but didn't go far enough, then the page would kind of like, snap back. And the inference is that was similar to the bounce back feature. You actually scrolled to the edge with this thing. It didn't do anything special. There was no, revealing the blank space and having it bounce back to the edge. So as a visual cue, it was interesting, but wasn't necessarily a direct corollary to the bounce back pattern.
Right.
Even more visual example was this thing called tablecloth that was on the Diamond Touch. And that was basically, they showed it to us, it looked like a Windows desktop, and you could use a finger to go and scroll up or down, and it would reveal a second desktop right behind it, like a mirror image, the exact same image. And then you let go of that, it would snap back again. So once again, interesting visual similarity, but not the same functionality. Definitely not, what was described in the bounce back pattern, which is very, very specific about what they're doing, how that process works.
Right. So Matt, let me ask, you're a patent lawyer, right? Aren't you? Isn't that what you do for us? I don't know. You just hang out. What's your take on kind of this prior art that they're showing and how it kind of relates to Apple's bigger case?
Well, I've said from the beginning, I think that's where their best case is for defense, because I don't think they really have much of a non-infringement argument, at least on these older models that used to practice these various features. But I don't know how a jury's going to perceive it, because I think, the bounce back feature, whatever they call it, in that Diamond Touch is not the same thing. It doesn't match up very well with the claims. But that doesn't necessarily mean a jury won't kind of put it on top of there and figure out a way to see it as an invalidating reference. But I just don't. What were the other ones? What did they use for invalidity on the tap to zoom, Brian?
That hasn't shown up yet. It seemed like they were kind of hinting at it with the with Launch Tile, in that if you would zoom up, but in terms of that being a very specific thing, you double tap or you single tap and it zooms up. They haven't had any direct corollaries to that one. The one I think they have a really good shot with, though, is fractal zoom, because that pretty much looks like the exact same thing.
So Brian, what's the jury when they're going through this? And I completely agree with Matt that invalidity. I think Samsung's devices, especially the older ones, the Galaxy S and the S2. They do the same thing. So there's the non-infringement is whatever, but I think the better argument, and kind of the argument that I think most of us believe should be true, is the invalidity argument, that these ideas have been around, that Apple got patents on them by drafting claims around the prior art. What's the jury what's the jury looking like when they're going through kind of the technical, here's X, it doesn't compare to Apple's Y? Are they engaged? Are they bored? What's the situation?
They're into everything as long as it seems to be, visual or design related. And I think that's the way it feels in the court just in general. Like, everybody's engaged by that stuff. When it starts drilling down into the real specifics of technical patents, the stuff today, it gets really, really snoozy. It's hard to go and stay engaged because they're drilling down to such a level. They were seeing source code today that wasn't being shown up on the public screens that we couldn't see. But you get down to a level of granularity that it's just hard to be engaged with. I think that's really set up here as well as they could have by dropping into this stuff today, kind of out of left field. But for the most part of all the design stuff, they're really engaged. And in several of the examples Samsung showed earlier this week in terms of prior art for the iPhone and iPad design patents was compelling. They're not necessarily the exact same kind of device. When you look at all the illustrations up together next to the iPhone patents, they do look like, rectangles. They do have like centered screens. There's a lot of similar elements there. So it depends, I think, on how well the jury is going to go and buy into, what the distinguishing elements of those features are. Like how broad is just, a centered screen? How important is the low lines on the side? How important is the notion of a bezel in terms of being an actual bezel or the impression of one from, a plastic, line in the plastic. It kind of comes down to how they're going to interpret all this stuff.
Yeah. So actually, let me talk about non-infringement for a second, because I just remembered something that I definitely wanted to talk about. Last week, Brian, you caused what I would call a firestorm of controversy. Because Samsung was trying to show that its devices did not infringe several of Apple's patents. I think chief among them, the scroll back patent, the bouncing scroll. Everybody knows what I'm talking about. And they were showing some devices, and it wasn't clear what they were showing, and it wasn't clear that they were even using the devices in a way that would cause the behavior. And you wrote, they're trying to mislead the jury in a headline, which I agreed with, and I think Brian agreed with too. Can you explain what was going on with that argument and why you reacted so strongly to it?
Well, there are about 3 or 4 examples over the course of the day. And it first started off that they were showing a Galaxy Tab, the 7-inch, the original Galaxy Tab, and basically saying, look, it doesn't go and have this bounce-back feature, to which the expert said, well, no, it does in the version I did, and there are several different, applications in which it has that functionality. And it was such a direct assault to think, no, you're just lying. It was just a weird way to approach it, because it wasn't necessarily like they were talking about the minutiae or the specifics. It was just a device, didn't say what version of the OS it was running, didn't say what version of TouchWiz it was running. It was just, here's something that has that same form factor that doesn't do this. We're going to infer here that you're wrong, that you're incorrect, that you're lying, which was just weird because there can be a version, depending on, software updates, that kind of stuff, that doesn't have the behavior. But those are the important elements that determine whether that's legitimate or not. You have to go and by that. And the fact that they just presented that with no context felt really, really weird. And they followed up later. They were showing bounce back features with 1.1 in the browser, scrolling up and down and saying, look, we're scrolling up and down and it's not having the bounce back. But they weren't scrolling all the way to the edge of the screen, which is what activates the bounce back in the first place. And the witness corrected them. And it was just kind of odd. And then they went back to another one. They were talking about, single finger scrolling, dual finger scrolling, dual finger gestures. And they said, and basically asked the witness, does the Galaxy Tab, have dual finger scrolling? And he said, no, it doesn't. And they said, well, yes, it does. And they basically showed a video of a user, basically scrolling with 2 fingers. But what they were doing is they were, moving their fingers, in and out while they were going. They were pinch to zooming while they were scrolling, which also works on an iPhone the same way, or an iPad the same way. And trying to misrepresent that as 2 fingers scrolling was incorrect. I mean, that's not the way the devices work. If you're talking about do Samsung devices, scroll with 1 finger, then have gestures with 2, they do.
Right. So, Matt, let me ask you, is this just more courtroom theatrics? Is this what patent attorneys trying to do in front of a jury? They try to, I mean, is this presenting a case zealously, or is this technical incompetence? It's lame.
It's lame. Because, there's times when there's gray areas in how you describe things compared to the claim language and whether or not you're arguing about whether your feature is the same or if it's operating the same way. But when you're actually, kind of playing games like that, I don't know what you're going to prove, because I assume, it sounds like the expert called them on it.
Yeah.
And even if the expert wouldn't have, that Apple's attorneys would have on redirect. So I just think it makes you look bad, and I don't think it gets you anywhere. I mean, it's a bad tactic.
Do you think that they have a good non-infringement tactic at all? I mean, you're Samsung's attorney. What do you say?
On the designs, maybe better. Yeah. I don't think they really have that. I mean, it sounds like I think on the designs it's about it, because I don't think that what's come out. I mean, we saw some of these dealt with, especially design patents, in a preliminary injunction motion. And Judge Koh said, she pretty much dismissed all the claims except ended up being a Tab 10.1. But in each case for the design patent, she says I think there's one that she didn't, but it's likely infringed and likely valid, but there's no irreparable harm. So, I mean, and we're talking about the same basic prior art here. Now, I don't know if the Diamond Touch was part of it, but I know that other table, what's it called? The
Brian,
the second one of those 2. What is it?
Launch trial?
Oh, launch tile. Yeah, okay.
Yes, that was part of the preliminary injunction motion as well, and it didn't win the day, obviously. So, no, I think on the designs they might have it. I mean, jury's different than Judge Coe. They can convince a jury, where they couldn't convince Judge Coe. But I still don't really see the utility patents getting knocked out, and I think it's pretty clear they're infringed. So, I mean, that's even if you knock out one or two of the designs and maybe one of the utilities, I mean, you still have a pretty big case going forward. For Apple, whether it's an injunction or damages,
right?
Most likely damages. It's still a significant amount.
So let me ask about, in terms of paring this down. Samsung argued that Apple shouldn't have included the International Galaxy S, the S2, and the Galaxy Ace, which is funny because I ranted and raved about why the Galaxy Ace was in the trial last week. So I'm assuming Samsung listened to me and took action upon my words. Yeah. Obviously.
Yep.
What does that mean? I mean, the Galaxy S2 in particular, the International S2, was a massive selling device, huge hit around the world. Does that affect their damages calculation? Does that affect, I mean, and in many ways, I think the S2 and the Ace, they touch on those design patents much more directly than some of the other products. The Epic Touch 4G, right? I mean, I don't think that it's a QWERTY slider. It looks appreciably different. Whereas the Ace and the S2, they look very much like the iPhone. Does getting them out of the case reduce Apple's damages claim? Does it reduce the effectiveness of their case? Matt, what's kind of your sense there? And then Brian, I want to get your sense about how that's playing out in front of the jury.
My sense is that it's not a huge. This is the hard part. We haven't been able to get exact number breakdowns of where each one of these phones kind of falls into the damage model.
Yeah.
So I know that the S, there's a big part of these that are U.S. sales, and to be realistic, the international was i9000 and i9100.
Yep.
S1 and S2 variants. Those should never have been in the case because there's never any indication that they were sold directly to the U.S. other than through some
through resellers,
internet purchase. Got it shipped there, but so I don't really see it. I don't know. I don't know if it's, maybe Brian has a better idea because he's heard him talking about that and kicking those phones out of the trial, but I haven't really seen a number attached to them. Right.
Well, Brian, let's talk about when they got kicked out, because it was another contentious Samsung moment in the court when they were arguing that they should kick these phones out. Can you talk us through what happened there and sort of what the judge and Samsung's attorneys were discussing?
Yeah, well, it was funny because, at the end, we saw this in Oracle as well. At the end of the case, each side kind of files for a judgment, basically, for various things, right? And in this case, Samsung basically said, we want to go and, file that Apple didn't prove everything, so we should just win and everything's good. And Judge, in the days leading up, she said, hey, I just want to do these. I don't want the Rule 50 thing to be a big deal. I want to kind of, move on with the trial. And when it happened, Samsung wanted to go and provide a lengthy argument. They wanted to go and mention multiple details about why they thought Apple hadn't proved its case and whatnot. And Coe got very, very frustrated and was like, basically, I've never had anybody need to go and file a written brief for Rule 50. This is ridiculous. They made their argument. They made the argument. Finally, she said, okay. And it went on for about an hour. I know it took a while.
Yeah.
But it was interesting because they talked about these phones. She basically rejected everything else that they requested except for these three phones. But Apple didn't put up a fight. Apple there was a brief discussion about it, and then basically she said, what's the deal? And Apple said, okay. And then that was just over.
Yeah.
It was kind of like this. It kind of felt like Apple really wasn't fighting that hard for it either.
Right. I mean, because why would they? Who cares? I mean, they're not selling it.
Because it was a loser argument to try to keep those phones.
Yeah, it just seems weird that they would have included that in the first place, except for the fact that they're trying to go and get the marquee non-carrier branded versions of these things up here. They're just pure and title, Galaxy S. And also the truth is, a lot of those comparison documents that we've seen have been for the original Galaxy S, not the domestic variant. It's just these icon comparisons and all these there's 2 or 3 at this point. These documents, internal Samsung documents, comparing the iPhone to the Galaxy S, the GTI 9000, saying, how can we improve it to be more like the iPhone? And so I feel like that may have motivated part of why they wanted it in there, because then if it's not in at a certain point, maybe those documents don't hold as much water.
Yeah.
But it wasn't like Apple put up a huge strenuous fight at the end of the day. They kind of like, let it go and moved on.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I think they got to do discovery on the Galaxy S2, which is the phone that led to all the US variants. And then when Samsung threw it out, they're like, whatever, we got our necessary evidence in front of the jury. And now we can just say, like, you saw the Samsung Fascinate was from the S2, and here's the process that led to the S2. I'm not sure that they couldn't have gotten there in a more indirect way by saying it the precursor, but they did it. They accomplished their goal. So, Brian, let's talk a little bit about what happened today with the judge asking both sides to pare down their cases, saying, please don't confuse the jury, get your CEOs together. You both have a lot to lose. What's your sense there from her? I mean, what was that moment like?
She's always, since the beginning of this thing, she's been pushing everybody to go and, trim this down because she does not want to have a long trial. She just wants things to move along. She has, criminal cases coming up she wants to, move on to. So she's never been shy about basically saying, cut it down, be reasonable. But it was interesting because, she started asking for this narrowing, basically bringing up the 3 phones that have been kicked out as an example of hey, you guys really didn't need to go and ask for it, Apple. Maybe you can kind of go trim it as well, a couple more runs. But then she asked them to the CEOs to meet again, and both sides agreed readily. There wasn't any hesitation there. But it was interesting because she called them out on a couple of things. She said, basically, I see bad things can be in store for both sides if this goes to trial. Even if we get a verdict and it's not the hung jury, it can still play out bad. And then she kind of called them out, and it was really, really great. She said, the whole reason you guys are doing this is just to make everybody really, really aware of your intellectual property. Mission accomplished. Now it's time to stop. So it was funny. She just kind of called it out because obviously that's a lot of what's going on here. I think there's a lot of chest beating on Apple's part. To make everybody really, really scared to go and mess with their designs and their patents and force people to go and design around.
Yeah. Yeah. So, in other ways, she's doing what she has to do because you're never going to get people to settle unless you convince them they both have something to lose. So, she's kind of just doing what every judge would do. Well,
but my assumption is that the settlement talks have been going on in the background of this the entire time. Matt, there's no way you would have a trial without constantly talking about settlement with the other side throughout.
No, I think there's been a lot of settlement. I think it's, that brings up a good point. Those documents that came up at the end of last week that showed that they, exactly the details of some of the offers that Apple made or the deal they were trying to work out, at least initially, with Samsung. That's been going on many, many more times than we could possibly know, I'm sure. Even up to date. I think those talks that we've seen right before the trial and then like a month or two before that, those are just, kind of the judge forced them to get in the same room, but I'm sure it's nothing more than they've been doing already.
Well, do you think that actually saying you've got to get Tim Cook, you've got to get the CEO of Samsung, whose name I'm just not going to butcher in this forum, you've got to get these guys together in a room, and they've got to be the ones who make the settlement agreement. Do you think that the lawyers are having settlement conversations and is just pushing the actual executives to do something, or is this a show?
Not a ton during the trial, and I don't know how helpful it is because we've already seen them get in a room together.
Yeah,
at least twice, right? And nothing's come of it. And I think we have a pretty good idea why. I don't think. We've seen kind of surprisingly just how willing Apple was, and I want to qualify that. They were very willing to settle, but think about their offer. They're willing to give them their whole portfolio, even these quote unquote fundamental core patents. But the price was very high. It was the big dispute here, I think, and the reason it's not settling is because in the end, in these cross-license deals, you usually have a net winner, a net payer and a net winner. And I think Apple's asking for a huge amount of money and getting all of Samsung's portfolio in a cross-license and only giving them like a 20% discount based on that portfolio. So they're coming out with big money on the other end of that. And there's ego problems with that with Samsung. There's value problems because they do have, whether or not it's really the same type of portfolio, it's pretty clear it's not.
Yeah.
But there's still a lot of value in it, with regard to some of these standards patents and some of the kind of core fundamental hardware patents. So I think it's just that Apple would settle. I just think that they probably aren't moving off those big numbers.
Brian,
And they are big.
They're huge. They're compared to, we thought Motorola's offers at $2.25 a unit were insane or whatever, or $2.25%. That's what it was.
Yeah, yeah.
That's what it was, not dollars. I'm crazy.
They want $30 for a Samsung phone and $40 for a tablet.
I mean, that's bonkers. So, Brian, let me ask you: when you're in the courtroom, and this is wild. I'm basically asking you to do Us Magazine body language reading here. I mean, what is your read on the lawyers and the executives who are showing up every day? Is Apple's side ignoring Samsung? Are they talking to each other before and after? Are they throwing spitballs at each other? What's your vibe of the emotion in the room?
You're not seeing anybody talking to each other, and that's a big difference from Google Oracle, because they would always kind of powwow or be fine. I don't want to say it's necessarily contentious, but it does seem like they aren't hanging out and chatting it up and being cool. After everything wraps, it's usually one side on their side, the other side on the other side. In terms of executives, there's been some Samsung executives that have been in the overflow courtroom, and some that are, in the stands. They're just very, very reserved and aren't interacting with people in general. Mm-hmm. It's also a matter of styles of the attorneys. Everybody has their own kind of, vibe, in the courtroom.
Yeah.
And that kind of carries over when they're arguing about, objections and all these kind of things. That can go and get a little heated because, they're both getting pressed by Co on both sides. She's hammering them both to kind of, hurry it along or be more realistic. Or anytime she can get them to go and, move things along quicker, she does. And she's not, and she does it to both of them. So if you have both sides, arguing to her point, that can get a little frustrating and there can be some cutting off and that kind of thing. And that's sometimes happening, depending on what the situation is, that can be happening, in front of the jury.
Right.
Although in most cases they try to keep it really, really mellow in front of those guys and present a nice, a calm face.
Right. So let me ask you, who is it's been 2.5 weeks now of this for you?
Yeah.
Who's kind of the smoothest lawyer on what side? Because I know in Google Oracle it was clearly Robert Van Nest on the Google side who was leading the charge in terms of being the most charismatic in front of the jury. Who's really leading the charge here?
Everybody's splitting stuff up. It's hard to pick a particular person. I think Charles Verhoeven is pretty good because he's good when witnesses can kind of get defensive. Mm-hmm. He's good at kind of being fun, and so is Bill Price for that matter. Both on the Samsung side, they're both really, really good in working with witnesses. With Apple, you have William Lee who he's good at just going for people.
Yeah.
Without seeming like a big jerk, he can kind of do those great, it's almost like a courtroom TV moment where he's like, what about this? And you're like, oh, no. And he's going to present that without coming off like a jerk.
Yeah.
And Michael Jacobs, who was also, was an attorney for Oracle, he just always feels vaguely just kind of floating above everything. He's just not very engaging on a human personal level, I don't feel like.
Yeah.
Which I think may have been a problem, in Oracle, actually, for Oracle.
Yeah.
So it kind of varies from person to person. The one person I think that still, has some stigma attached to them, and I don't know if the jury feels this way because they didn't see what we saw, but this in the courtroom, it does feel every time, John Quinn on Samsung side steps up, mm-hmm. You're expecting something outrageous to happen, but that was just a tone he set early on, and that's probably why he hasn't been around so much then.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he did make it seem like he was, and he's not, he's like a famous litigator, he's a high-end attorney. He's not a cheap guy to have on your side, and it's funny that he set this tone of being completely out of control at the beginning because that's not his.
And just to be clear, both sides, both of these teams are so smart and so good and so professional. It's neat to go and see them do their thing, even if they're strange tactics. These are all just really, really smart people, and everything they do, I think, is very, very calculated and intelligent. There's always a motivation behind it.
So,
but I was talking to Brian about that, and he said it's interesting that Judge Alsop in the Oracle case was very. I mean, I think there's a couple of times he said, great arguments. He was kind of appreciated the lawyering that was going on, to the most extent. But Co is, she's just had it. I mean, to come right out and say, I need it written down. I need evidence because I don't trust anything you guys say in this courtroom.
Yeah.
I mean, that's pretty harsh, and you don't hear that very often from a judge talking to lawyers that are representing clients in front of her. I mean, that's bizarre.
Well, I think my theory on this is that this goes back to them trying to settle. I think the gamesmanship at trial is ultimately about leverage in these other conversations that are happening. And I think on many levels, both Samsung and Apple, maybe not at the legal division, but in the executive division, cannot believe that this has gotten this far and that there will be a resolution and the jury will make a decision, and that either Samsung has to pay $2 billion or Apple has to pay however much and have some of its patents invalidated that they think are treasures. I don't think their executives believe that day will come. And so they're playing this game of brinksmanship, and they're using the court as a proxy. And I think Judge Koh really sees that. I think she understands that really what's happening in her courtroom is a proxy for what's happening in a settlement or a conference room somewhere in settlement negotiations. And she's really irritated about it. I mean, that's the sense I'm getting.
Yeah. Do you think they're going to settle before or during deliberations?
I kind of do. At this point, I kind of do. It's so dumb. I mean, how can you run one of these companies? If you're Tim Cook and the jury is in deliberations, how can you say we're going to leave it up to it's 9 guys, right, Brian? Or nine people, rather.
Yeah.
We're going to leave it up to these 9 strangers who we don't know to decide the value of our patent portfolio and the value of what Samsung did to us in the past with these other devices. If you're running Samsung, how do you say, we're going to let these 9 people decide if we have to pay Apple $2 billion? Like, that to me is great. You made your case, you presented it, the Verge ran 100 stories about your internal documents. Like, that's great, and it's all wonderful. But at the end of the day, it just, these companies have to continue to compete, and on a broader level, they have to continue to partner. And if they can't figure this out, I mean, I do think it'll be like the last day of deliberation, unless the jury goes away for like 10 minutes and they come out and they're like, "Yep, they did it." Like, I don't,
It could. Yeah, I mean, I think it would be the best of both worlds if they did, because we get all the fun. We had all the fun that we had, and but yet the market doesn't really change that much. And I think behavior has changed, like we talked about last week.
Yeah.
I think things are different between what Samsung's doing now and what they did then. So that's, perhaps a good thing. So I think you still get the change you maybe want. You get some value, because I'm sure that there would be some money exchanging hands in any settlement. And like I said, we got to write about this stuff and see all these cool documents. Yeah, and oddly enough, Apple didn't really. I think a lot of people were worried they would settle, or thought they might settle, because they'd be afraid of all these documents. But for the most part, this stuff that we saw was all very interesting, but it's all historical.
Well, I talked to a source of mine, a person who worked on the iPhone. And I said, you had better get ready to relive 2006. Before the trial started, you better get ready to relive 2006, because you're going to see everything that ever happened. I mean, that time of your life is going to be poured over and examined by the press, and we're going to talk about. And this person, she, mermaid, merman, could be anyone, said to me, that's cool. I want people to know how much hard work we did to make the iPhone, because nothing like it existed before. And I think that was the attitude at Apple. I think that it's like, whatever, it's out. As long, we're not talking about the iPhone 5. We're not talking about the next iPad. We're talking about a product that came out 3 years ago and changed the industry. Like, have at it. Here are all of our bad ideas that didn't change the industry. I don't think they care. And that to me, this idea that Apple is some like irrational, crazy actor that doesn't know how to run a business and is like purely emotional and operates on passion alone is insane.
Thermonuclear war thing, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, so Steve Jobs might have been the CEO of Apple, and he might have said, I'm going to blow up Android, spend all the money, but he had to report to a board of directors, and he had an army of employees who could say, that is stupid. Like, ultimately, that is stupid. And I don't think even Steve Jobs, I don't think, had the power to say, we're going to blow all of Apple's enormous amount of cash reserves on killing Android just because I'm mad. I think it's something. There are plenty of checks and balances in that system. So Brian, I know you're going back into the trial, right? You're running out of time.
Yeah, I need to jump off. Yeah, we're starting up in 7 minutes here, so I need to jet.
All right. Well, hey, I think next week. It's not 5 days next week, is it?
No, we're 3 days from here on out, and Co is hoping that the jury's going to be in deliberations, in next week. So this thing is going to be progressing even quicker soon.
All right. Well, Brian, it's great to have you. We're looking forward to more reports this week from you, and we'll have you on the podcast again next week.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, guys. Take care.
See ya.
All right, take it
Bye.
easy.
All right, Matt. Any last? You cut off Matt. There's Matt again. Now you got two Brians.
That's right. Two Brians is better than one Matt.
Can we get a patent on two Brians? Double Brian?
Yeah.
Can we file? Matt,
Yeah.
can you write something up? So, Matt, let me get some last thoughts before we go. How do you think Samsung's on the offensive now, right? They've done invalidity. They're starting to get into their Fran patents and all this other stuff. How do you think their offensive case is going to play with the jury? And then we can.
Well, I've been trying to get a feel for that from Brian yesterday and today. It sounds like it was really kind of scattered. They were jumping around between kind of their offensive case. Now that they're presenting, the primary, doing all the direct examinations, they were jumping between, kind of invalidity, non-infringement, jump back to their offensive case on their patents. And I think now it's kind of settled into just their offensive case today on their patents. And my guess is it's incredibly boring. They have, unfortunately, they have to have translators in there for a couple of witnesses. So it's very methodical and dry and slow.
Yeah.
And I think that doesn't help. And I just learned something from Brian today, which is really bizarre to me, is that as they were questioning, they were presenting their evidence on these Fran patents, which we know are the case. And from the very beginning, I've thought that was the biggest snafu that Samsung made, is keeping those patents in the case going before a jury. Because first you have Apple presenting their story, their narrative, and copiers, and we're innovators, and then you get to where Apple's defending, and then they get to bring that story back up and say, see these bad guys? Now they're trying to throw Fran patents at us and standard patents. It's desperation. So I figured, they would, by the end, they would just eliminate those Fran patents because they're such a wart on their case that I had a hard time believing they would keep it. But then I found out today that for some reason something's happened in this case, and I'm not sure where, if there's been some briefing that we didn't see, but the judge and Samsung is basically keeping Apple from really asking these experts anything about Fran issues. They're talking about the wireless technology, and they're talking about whether it's actually performed by the iPhone and the iPad, which ones, and they're talking about licensing, I think, with Qualcomm and Infineon. But when it gets to actually Apple trying to tell a story about these are Fran patents and they're standard and you can't do this with them, it's getting cut off.
Really? The judge is cutting them off.
Yeah, apparently they were objecting, and the judge is sustaining the objections on those issues. And I'm not sure if that's because they haven't opened the door enough to it, but I don't know why. Because to me, the easy argument for Apple there is we can talk about this all day long because it affects the damages we have to pay on these patents because they're Fran patents, and the percentages are lower, and you can talk about what it means to be Fran.
Yeah.
But for some reason, they're just they haven't been able to get into that story, and that could be huge for Samsung if they can present these patents as kind of normal patents and not really get into the obligations. Under Fran, I think they can avoid that stigma.
Well, but there isn't. Honestly, the legal mechanics of this are so opaque. But they don't have. Apple doesn't have the breach of contract claim at issue here, right? It's just a patent infringement claim. It's either you do or you don't. Not you did infringe this patent. Yeah, but you've got to put the claim in there, though, right? It's either you do infringe the patent or you don't, and then the stuff of, well, we had to infringe the patent in order to use the standard, or we have a contract with this standards group that you will license the patent to us. That to me, those are alternate claims, aren't they?
Yeah. Yeah, but I don't understand. I guess they've tried to actually talk about it. That's the weird part. Is they keep trying to go in on this, and Samsung's quick to object, and the court's keeping them away from it. Well, and it seems like if you're arguing non-infringement, you could also be arguing. Yeah, maybe it's a case. Okay, now you do cross on. Yeah, I don't know. To me, it seems like these witnesses would be the witnesses, but maybe it's just because they're experts on infringement,
right?
And
that's
it's not relative to the Fran. So at some point they'll have somebody up there that can actually testify as to the standards part of this.
Yeah, you
this whole-
think Apple's going to put up somebody, some old French engineer from Etsy,
Yes.
to be like, yeah, that'll be great. All right, well, Matt, I think we should wrap this up. We've gone plenty deep this week. Always a pleasure to have you, Ghost Brian. I'm going to miss you. Next Wednesday, Creighton. That's next Wednesday. We're doing this again, and we'll be cruising towards either a jury or a settlement by then. I would say. Don't you think?
Yeah, this
Matt?
case is like 3/4 done. I mean, the fact that Co was trying to still streamline the case more didn't really make sense to me because the case is almost done.
I think she doesn't
Yeah,
want to
look,
hand
I-
that big sheet of paper to the jury that says, "Here's 50
Yeah,
claims and 20 phones." I mean, that's got to be it. So we'll see what she does. We'll be tracking that. Brian's there. They started again according to his 7-minute calculation, and we'll keep you updated for the rest of the week. And we'll be back again with the podcast next Wednesday. So thanks very much for listening. This has been the Vergecast special edition, Apple versus Samsung. Matt, thanks a lot, buddy.
Yeah, good times. Well,
Rock and
next
roll.
Wednesday.